Whenever historians are asked to rank the best U.S. presidents, you can bet your bottom dollar that Franklin Delano Roosevelt will be toward the top of that list, if not in the #1 spot. And while there are aspects to his 4-term rule that we can appreciate, those pale in comparison to the sheer amount of damage his presidency did to this nation. FDR and his New Deal represented the spirit tip in the rise of the managerial elite who govern us to this day. Some now call that the deep state. From the way FDR's progressive bureaucratic ilk extended the Great Depression, to the way they tried to take over the U.S. Supreme Court, to the way they decided to throw their lot in with the Soviets during World War II. Roosevelt wanted America to think of Stalin as Uncle Joe. And one of his VPs, Henry Wallace, even went to Russia to see mystics and to be enamored by the fake Potemkin villages that the commies cobbled together to fool outsiders like Wallace into thinking Russian peasants were so happy with their new Bolshevik dictators. Thankfully, in a moment of clarity, FDR helped to more or less rig his last Democrat convention so that Wallace would be swapped with Harry S. Truman on the ticket, because FDR knew that he was dying and he didn't want Wallace to succeed him in office if he were to die as president, which he did in 1945, in April in fact. There's obviously a lot here to talk about. Our next guest is just the guy to do it. He has a new book out that was just released on October 10th titled The New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights, The Untold Story of FDR's Concentration Camps, Censorship, and Mass Surveillance. Joining us now to discuss is author Dr. David T. Beito, a research fellow at the Independent Institute and professor emeritus at the University of Alabama. Thanks so much for being here tonight, Dr. Beito.
Thank you for inviting me.
Great. So can you talk to us about what gave you the inspiration to write this book in the first place? Maybe you saw a lot of those presidential ranking lists and you felt the need to correct the record, but talk to us about why you decided to write this book.
Well, I have been teaching for many years, and I was familiar with FDR's economic policy, which was not very successful. And then, I started to look more and more into his administration just as a historian. It would see things. I said, this guy just strikes me as somebody that's getting a free ride, especially when it comes to the issue of civil liberties. So I started to look more closely at the Bill of Rights, the rights of to be secure in your own possessions, the First Amendment, and that kind of thing, and saw a record that was arguably the worst of any president in modern American history. And a lot of people nominate Woodrow Wilson as the most anti-civil liberties president. I actually think FDR, even if you leave out Japanese internment, his attitudes are more hostile towards civil liberties. And I saw this guy was ranked, as you said, he's usually #1 or #2. He's way up there. Wilson was way up there too for a while. And I said, this just doesn't jive from what I know about his administration and the administration of other presidents who arguably deserve to be ranked higher.
And so, of course, a lot of our viewers will be aware of at least the internment camps that Japanese Americans were put into. But when it comes to the mass surveillance and the censorship, I think that that's not as well known. So first, if we could hit on some of those points, could you enlighten some of the viewers and hopefully potential readers of your book, what they will discover in the pages of your book, especially when it comes to the censorship and the mass surveillance part?
I think they will discover a lot more about internment as well, let me just say, because FDR played very much a hands-on role in that. That is often neglected. Well, mass surveillance. There was a Senate committee that was working with the administration, headed by Senator Hugo Black, called the Black Committee, and they were able, through the FCC, to get access to millions of private telegrams. They went through literally 3 million private telegrams because the telegraph companies were required to keep copies of all telegrams, and they got it wasn't even a subpoena. They got a order from the FCC to give the committee access to these private telegrams. So what Black would do is he'd call people in, he'd call witnesses in, he had their private telegrams. It'd be analogous today to someone calling you in as a witness. Somebody has access to all of your emails, because telegrams were really the emails of the time. People would be much more candid. They didn't save them usually. They were just for the moment, that kind of thing. And so this was an incredible example of mass surveillance, I think, going through 3 million private telegrams. So that's one example that I could point to on the mass surveillance.
And also, as you're talking about the Japanese internment camps, as I mentioned earlier, I know a lot of viewers are going to be aware of that. But then, as you talked about, there's a lot more that goes into the story. I'm here in Southern California, and I often go up to Lake Tahoe with my family. And on the way, I believe the camp is called Manzanar. It's one of those
Yeah.
historical sites. It's one of the internment camps that were used, Japanese Americans. So even talking about people who are not Japanese foreign nationals, but American born, even they were being hauled away to these internment camps because of their Japanese heritage. I know there were some Germans and some Italians who got caught up in that as well, but it was mostly the Japanese. And as you talked about a moment ago, FDR perhaps had a bigger role in that than is previously known. Could you dive into some of those details for us?
Well, first of all, you're right. It's much bigger than the internment camps for Germans and Italians. For example, the only way you get there if you're of Japanese ancestry. So, for example, children of Japanese ancestry in orphanages were put in the camps. That didn't happen to Germans and Italians. FDR's hands-on role as early as 1936, he's proposing what he calls, this is why I use the term concentration camps, because it's what he said, one reason. He says we need to put the Japanese Americans in concentration camps if they or their relatives have ever met Japanese ships in the harbor in Hawaii. FDR was very friendly to the idea. There was, surprisingly, he took a couple months to do it. And if you look at the attitude in Southern California, including of leading newspapers, including of government officials like the Attorney General, there was a lot of people just said, no, we don't need to do anything like this. We don't need to throw them in the camps. They're American citizens after all. But Roosevelt sort of let this anti-Japanese feeling percolate. He didn't tamp it down. He gave it leeway, and then ultimately, of course, he signs on to the internment. But there was a lot of opposition to it, and there was not as much demand as people make out. A lot of people say, "Well, he had to do it because of all this hysteria." Not really. His own attorney general said there wasn't that much hysteria that he had to do it. He could have taken an affirmative step and defended the Japanese. He never did that. And the FBI director was against internment, J. Edgar Hoover. Several people in the federal government were against it. And that's a hopeful part of the story here. I'm finding a lot of pushback against FDR, including from New Dealers. So you have people on the right and the left coming together to oppose some of these civil liberties excesses. That's what holds him in check. And I see that as kind of a positive thing for today. Maybe we could get more of that happening, where left and right could get together, because if they combine, they're much more powerful. If they're limited, I'm just going to defend civil liberties for my guy, they're in a weaker position.
No, I think that's exactly right. And see, you taught me something about that. I had assumed, I guess like many people assumed, that it was because of widespread hysteria that forced FDR's hand on this. But like you're saying, that's not necessarily the case. So I encourage all viewers to pick up a copy of your book. Doctor, before I let you go tonight, where can viewers find your book? How can they buy it? Where can they go? Where are they going to look for it? And also, what do you hope that they take away from it?
Well, they can go to Amazon or they can go to the Independent Institute, either one. The book is affordable, unlike a lot of books these days. There's a lot of research in it, so I've got the evidence. I devoted 15 years of my life to doing this primary documents research, including secondary research, what historians have said, but also the nitty gritty. So they're going to learn a lot new. We'll even learn a lot new about Japanese internment. They'll learn a lot about FDR and race, Black Republicans being targeted, for example. That story has been pretty much untold. And they'll learn some inspiring examples. I find them inspiring, of people pushing back, people saying, I'm going to take a risk for these people, even though I don't politically agree with them. That kind of thing that you just don't see as much as you used to. So it's a lesson for both left and right in that respect.
Well, congrats on the new book. I can't wait to dive into it myself. Dr. David T. Beito, thank you so much for joining us tonight.